Recent headlines paint a chaotic picture. GFX headline: The Washington Post, Trump imposes 25% tariffs on Mexico, Canada. President Trump lashes out, accusing Canada of disgraceful trade practices with dairy tariffs nearing 300%. Meanwhile, quiet reports surface that Mexico, America's single largest dairy customer, is beginning to slow its intake of U.S. milk. For American dairy farmers across the heartland, from the rolling hills of Wisconsin to the vast plains of Texas, this isn't just news. It's a direct threat to their livelihood and their legacy. Is the North American Dairy Alliance, a bedrock of continental trade, about to curdle? For decades, the flow of dairy across the Rio Grande was a cornerstone of North American trade. The relationship was symbiotic and immensely profitable. Mexico, with its growing population and appetite for dairy, became the undisputed largest foreign market for American producers. In 2024, it absorbed a staggering 576,000 metric tons of U.S. dairy products, representing more than a quarter of America's total global dairy exports. To the north, the dynamic with Canada was more structured but equally vital. Governed by trade agreements like the USMCA, the U.S. sent over $1.1 billion in dairy products to Canada in 2024, a figure that had grown by nearly 55% since 2020, primarily within duty-free quotas. It was a finely tuned ecosystem built on mutual dependency. But beneath this lucrative surface, deep-seated tensions were simmering, particularly with Canada. The primary source of friction is Canada's highly protected supply management system. It's a policy fortress designed to shield its domestic farmers from price fluctuations by controlling production and, critically, by imposing massive tariffs on imports exceeding quotas, sometimes climbing above 200% or even near 300% for certain products. This protectionism was a long-standing irritant for U.S. trade officials, but it erupted into a full-blown political flashpoint under President Trump, who publicly lambasted the system as unfair to American farmers. In a defensive crouch, Canada has since moved to legally reinforce its system, making it clear that its dairy sovereignty is non-negotiable. This escalating northern conflict created a volatile atmosphere, and as the U.S. focused its fire on Canada, its southern partner Mexico began quietly re-evaluating its own supply chains, setting the stage for a continental fracture. The fracture point arrived not with a quiet negotiation, but with a political sledgehammer. In March 2025, the Trump administration, citing unfair trade practices, imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on a wide array of goods from both Canada and Mexico. The move was the culmination of years of escalating rhetoric, particularly aimed at the North. President Trump had publicly decried Canada as very difficult, focusing his ire on its dairy tariffs, which he claimed were as high as 298%. This narrative, while politically potent, strategically oversimplified a complex system. The sky-high tariffs only apply to imports above the generous duty-free quotas negotiated under the USMCA. In reality, the vast majority of America's $1.1 billion in dairy exports to Canada entered tariff-free. But the nuance was lost in the political theater. The administration's stated goal was to pry open the Canadian market and level the playing field for American farmers who, they argued, were being shut out. The underlying motivation, however, was rooted in a desperate domestic reality. The American dairy industry was in a state of crisis. The number of licensed dairy farms had cratered, falling a staggering 44% in a decade, with just over 24,800 remaining by early 2025. This consolidation meant larger, more industrialized farms, but also the death of smaller, family-run operations, particularly in states like Wisconsin and New Mexico. Compounding this, national milk production was actually increasing, up 3.4% by June 2025, creating a surplus that depressed domestic prices and squeezed already razor-thin profit margins. For farmers in Texas, California, and Michigan, whose businesses were heavily reliant on the Mexican market, any disruption was a terrifying prospect. The pressure on Washington to do something was immense. The tariffs were a blunt instrument, a high-stakes gamble intended to force concessions. The administration was betting that the economic pain inflicted on its neighbors would be greater than the blowback on its own people. It was a bet that risked igniting a trade war on two fronts, with the American farmer standing squarely in the crossfire. Analysts warned that retaliatory measures could obliterate up to $16.6 billion in farm revenue, a catastrophic figure that would turn a crisis into a full-blown collapse. The tariff was not just a policy, it was an act of economic brinkmanship, born from a potent mix of political populism and the very real economic pain felt across America's heartland. Canada's response was swift, calculated, and utterly defiant. For Ottawa, the American tariffs were not just an economic attack, but an assault on a foundational pillar of their national agricultural policy: supply management. This system is the bedrock of Canadian dairy. It meticulously controls the domestic production of milk, eggs, and poultry to match Canadian demand, ensuring stable prices and a predictable income for farmers, insulating them from the wild price volatility that plagues their American counterparts. To protect this delicate balance, the system relies on tariff rate quotas, TRQs. It allows a significant volume of foreign products, like U.S. dairy, to enter the country duty-free to satisfy trade agreements. But once that quota is filled, prohibitive tariffs are triggered to prevent a flood of cheap imports from destabilizing the market. From the Canadian perspective, this isn't a hostile act of protectionism. It's an existential defense of their farmers' livelihoods and the sovereignty of their food system. Faced with the American tariff siege, Canada did not capitulate. It retaliated in kind, imposing its own dollar-for-dollar tariffs on a strategically chosen list of American goods. Simultaneously, the Canadian government moved to legally armor-plate its dairy system from foreign pressure. It passed Bill C-202, a federal law explicitly stating that Canada's negotiators cannot make concessions on supply management in future trade talks. It was a clear, unambiguous message to Washington. On dairy, there will be no surrender. This defensive posture was bolstered by the fact that the trade relationship, despite the rhetoric, was still functioning. U.S. dairy exports to Canada had grown significantly under the USMCA, demonstrating that the system, while restrictive, was not a closed door. Canadian officials viewed Trump's attacks as political posturing that ignored the facts on the ground. While they showed a willingness to de-escalate tensions in other areas, temporarily withdrawing a controversial digital services tax, for instance, dairy remained their red line. The Canadian government, backed by a powerful domestic farm lobby and broad public support for the system, dug in for a protracted fight, prepared to absorb the economic pain of a trade war to protect the core principles of its agricultural identity. The result is a dangerous North American stalemate. The United States is committed to its aggressive tariff strategy, unwilling to back down without a perceived victory for its farmers. Canada, in turn, has legally and politically fortified its defensive position, making any concession on supply management a political impossibility. But while Washington and Ottawa were locked in this high-stakes stare-down, the ground was shifting beneath their feet. The real and perhaps more damaging consequence was unfolding silently to the south. The explosive headline, "Mexico dumps U.S. milk," isn't the full story. There is no evidence of a massive, coordinated pivot from Mexico to Canada. Instead, something more subtle and potentially more permanent is happening. Spooked by the trade instability and hammered by the new 25% tariff, Mexico is quietly recalibrating its dependency on the U.S. market. Official USDA reports show a projected slowdown in Mexican imports of key U.S. products like non-fat dry milk for 2025, coupled with a renewed push to boost its own domestic dairy production. This isn't a dramatic breakup. It's a slow, strategic decoupling that threatens to erode America's most critical export market. The US-Canada feud created the perfect opening for Mexico to diversify, leaving American farmers caught in a vice, with their northern access blocked by a political wall and their southern lifeline beginning to fray. The cost to Canada is not measured in lost dairy sales, but in the price of defense. By refusing to buckle on supply management, Canada has been forced into a costly economic war of attrition with its largest trading partner. The retaliatory tariffs Ottawa placed on American goods were a necessary counterpunch, but they inflict pain at home. Canadian businesses that rely on U.S. parts now face higher costs, and consumers ultimately see higher prices on store shelves. The political capital expended is immense. Passing legislation like Bill C-202 was a powerful domestic statement, but it also signaled to the world that Canada was hardening its position, potentially complicating future trade negotiations on other fronts. The very system they are fighting to protect comes with its own steep internal price tag. While supply management provides stability for about 10,000 dairy farmers, critics argue it leads to some of the highest milk prices in the developed world for 40 million Canadians. The system is a social contract, and the trade war with the U.S. is testing its limits. Every dollar spent on lobbying, every hour of diplomatic negotiation, and every point of political friction is a resource diverted from other pressing national issues. For Canada, the primary cost is the strain of constantly defending a system that, while central to its agricultural identity, makes it a perennial target. They have successfully protected their farmers from the price volatility that plagues the U.S. market, but they cannot protect their broader economy from the ricochet of a trade dispute that has no clear end in sight. It is the heavy price of sovereignty. This is not a one-sided fight. The blowback from the tariff strategy is being felt acutely across American dairy states, creating a map of economic pain. Texas feels the most immediate shock. With nearly $890 million in dairy exports to Mexico in 2024, the state is profoundly dependent on its southern neighbor. WishysMakersAssen.org. For the mega dairies in the Panhandle, which are already battling extreme heat that damages production, the threat of Mexican retaliatory tariffs is an existential crisis. AG Daily. It transforms their single biggest market from a reliable customer into a source of crippling uncertainty. In California, the nation's #1 milk producer, the story is about cheese. The state sent $482 million in dairy to Mexico, but that figure was already down 12% year over year in 2024. WishysMakersAssen.org. As Mexico slows its orders, California's massive cheese processing plants are the first to feel it, and that pain is passed directly to farmers through lower milk prices. Further north in Wisconsin, the symbolic heart of American dairy, the impact is personal. Though its direct exports to Mexico are smaller at $72 million, the state's thousands of family-owned farms are the most vulnerable to price shocks. WishysMakersAssen.org, DATCP. When export markets weaken and surplus milk floods the domestic market, the national price drops. For a Wisconsin family trying to hold on to a multi-generational legacy, a few cents per hundredweight can be the difference between survival and foreclosure. The pain is structural in New Mexico, where massive dairies are optimized to produce milk powder for export. Dairy.nmsu.edu. The USDA's forecast of weakening Mexican demand for this specific product hits them directly where they are most exposed. USDA apps. And the damage ripples outward. Farmers in New York and Pennsylvania may not ship much milk to Mexico directly, but they sell into a national market. When a Texas or California farmer can't sell their milk south, it backs up the entire system, depressing prices for everyone, everywhere. NAS, The Washington Post. The North American dairy trade, once a symbol of continental integration, now stands at a fractured crossroads. The United States, in a desperate bid to save its struggling farmers, has ignited a two-front trade dispute that threatens to alienate its most vital partners. Canada remains defiant, shielding its sovereign agricultural system at great cost, while Mexico, the quiet giant in this dispute, is slowly looking elsewhere. The foundation of the alliance is being tested not by external forces, but by internal pressures and diverging national priorities. The ultimate question is not merely about tariffs or quotas, but about the future of the continent itself. As each nation retreats to protect its own, is this the dawn of a new era of zero-sum trade, or can a shared path to prosperity still be paved? If you found this story important, please like this video, comment with your thoughts below, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth reports.